Video on how to record subqueries. This is Dr. Payne, and today this video will cover what a subquery is, how you can work it into your regular select statement. We'll discuss the difference between a subquery and a join. You're going to find that you're more comfortable with one versus the other, and there's sometimes where you're going to have to use a subquery. So we're going to talk about using the subqueries in a where, a having, a from, and the select clauses within your select statement. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we have here is we have our basic select statement. We have a select, from, where, and order by. Within our where, we have another query. This is our subquery. So a subquery is just a query within a query. My recommendation to you is to run the subquery first to make sure it actually works. You can put it within your select statement, or you can go and you can run it separately. So if I just run this subquery, which I have selected here, and I use my single statement run, so this returns the average of my invoice total from my invoices. So I have I have a regular query in here. And what this outer query is doing is it wants to find all my invoice totals that are greater than my average. So first I have to find my average. I'm going to use my aggregate function average, and I'm going to put it in a simple select statement. This becomes my subquery. So again, a subquery is just a query within a query. So my average is 1897.74. So what I want to do is I'm going to pull back all my invoices where my total is greater than 1879.74. So if I run my overall query, it's going to bring back everything that's greater than 1879. So my lowest one here is 1927, and it comes all the way up to 37,000. So we can see that it's pulling just my invoices that are greater than my average. And maybe I want to know everything that's greater than my average so that I could go and I can give, maybe a discount to them, or I can ask for a discount. These are invoices. So I can ask for a discount because I'm going through and I'm spending a lot of money or something like that. But this is just a way to go through and to look at your invoices. Again, I would go and I would run your subquery first. You can run it in here, or you can just pull it out and run that, and that will return again your 1879. So this is a subquery within a where statement. There's a couple of different ways that we can go through and we can do our subqueries. And let me show you a quick query that uses a join that we're going to go and we're going to move that into a subquery. So here I have a simple join. I'm going to select my invoice number, my invoice date, and my invoice total, and I need those from my invoices and my vendors. I'm going to join them on my vendor ID, and I'm going to filter out everything that's not in California. And then I'll go ahead and I'll sort it by my invoice date. So if I go through and I execute this and I run it, I have my invoice number, my invoice date, and my invoice total. Everything is sorted by my invoice date. I could also use a join to do this. So the join that I'm using to do this is on my vendor ID where my vendor state equals California. So what I can do is I can use my in operator where my vendor ID is in a list, and the list of vendor IDs that I'm going to select are all my vendors that are in the state of California. So if I go and I just run this particular query, I should return all of my vendors that are in the state of California. And for this, because I just want to prove this, I'm going to add my vendor state. So I'm just going to run this query to make sure that that works. Let's see, let's try this again. I'm going to run just the inner query to see that that works. So I have my vendor ID and my vendor state, and that just pulls up everything that's in California. And we can see down here that that's everything in California. So I'm going to get rid of my vendor state because I just want to return a single list of my vendor IDs. So now my outer query is going to go and it's going to match my vendor IDs that are in this particular list. So we can see my vendor IDs down here below. So my inner query is going to return, and it's going to run first, is going to return my vendor IDs that are in the state of California, and then I'm going to make sure that my vendor ID is in that list so to come out in my overall query or my outer query. So I'm going to go ahead and run the full query. I have my invoice number, my invoice date, and my invoice total. And we can see here that it returned 40 rows. I sorted them by invoice date. So my first one is February 25th, 2014. And coming down, it goes to June 14th, 2014. If I run my query at the top, again, I have my 40, my invoice date, and then my starts in February and ends in June. So it returns the same thing. If I were going through and I were writing this for code, I would probably use a simple where statement. I would not use an inner join. But there are times where it is the only thing that you can do is use an inner join. For example, the one that we did above, that that you could use an inner query. The one that we did above, you have to go through and you have to find the average first. Just think if you were going through and you wanted to run this on a daily basis, you would have to go and find the average. Then you would have to come and put it in your where statement where invoice total is greater than 1,500. This does it for you automatically and dynamically. And the only way to do that is to use a subquery. So those are two examples of subqueries using your where statement. So that was an example of using the in operator. You could also use the not in. So an example of that is the same vendor IDs. We have distinct. We probably should have used distinct at the top. And that we want to go and we want to find the vendors that are not in that particular list. So if I go and I run, let's just run my inner query, it should bring back all of my vendor IDs. All right, so I have to grab the full query because I don't have a semicolon here at the end and it's not going to know where it is supposed to stop. So it takes a little bit just to grab that inner query. So I have a list of all of my vendor IDs. That are in my invoices, so vendors that I've paid. And then I want to pull off my vendors that I haven't paid. So maybe it's a new vendor, maybe it's a vendor that I set up an account with years ago. I'm not purchasing anything from them. So I probably want to archive their record. So if I go and I run my full query, so my outer query is going to select my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor states from my vendor tables that I have not received an invoice from, and I'll sort those by vendor ID. So let me go ahead and run those. So my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor state, I've returned 50 of them. If I come down here, it lists all of my vendors by the name and by the state. So there may be a reason that I haven't ordered anything from them. And then I can go and I can clean out my records. I can archive that information. All right, so let's go and move on to the next. So I could rewrite this query using a left join. Remember, the left join is going to take everything from my vendors table and it's going to join the matches on my right table. Again, everything from my left matching the information from my right. So it's going to take all of my vendors and it's going to match the ones that have an invoice. So if I go through and I run this, it's going to match my invoices on the right. It's going to match my vendor ID and it's going to go and it's going to find where my vendor ID is null. So in this case, because it's matching and it will take everything from my vendors, if my vendor ID is not there, then it's going to go and it's going to pull that back. So let me go and let me run this. We can see it returned the same 50 records, started with the U.S. Postal Service, coming all the way down to Dataforms West. So it's the same query as my query above using a subquery. This becomes a little bit more confusing to me because we're looking for the null values, and the null values are on my combined list of vendors and invoices. So again, it's going to list all of my vendors. It's going to match anything from my invoice ID and put that basically in my second column. And then it's going to return anything where my vendor ID is null. This subquery is a little bit easier to read because we can see in here it's going to return all my vendor IDs for my invoices, and then it's going to match where my vendor ID is not in that list. So this, for me, the subquery makes a little bit more sense. Again, you can write it with a join, or you can write it with a subquery. You're going to write it in a fashion that makes the most sense to you, unless you see it on an exam where it specifically states to write a subquery. All right. Okay, so let's move on to something that's a little bit more complicated. There's some syntax of the where clause where you have your expression, your comparison operator, you have some, any, and all in your subquery. So those are key words, and we're going to go and we're going to show you some examples of those as we move through the next couple of sections. So this one is a big, nasty, ugly select statement. And the select statement does have a subquery in it. So let's just take a look at the subquery, and then we'll go to the outer query. I always like starting with the subquery. The subquery is usually the simplest query that you have. So in this case, we're going to select the average invoice total minus payment total minus credit total. So this is the average that I still owe, right? So my invoice total minus my payment total, if I've paid it in full, it should be 0. Or maybe I was given a credit, so it's my invoice total minus my payment total minus my credit total. So I'm going to select the average of that from the invoices where my value, where I still owe something greater than 0. Because if I don't owe anything, I don't really want that returned. So let's go ahead and let's run this and see what I come up with. And the average that I still owe was about $1,670. So anything that is over $1,670, I want to go and I want to pull up. I want the invoice number, the invoice date. I want to show what my balance is, and it's going to display it as balance due from my invoices where I owe something, and what I owe is less than my average. So again, it's making many calculations through here, and then it's going to go and it's going to give me my invoice total sorted descending. So let's go ahead and run this. So I have my invoice number, my invoice date, and my balance due. And again, my balance due is less than my average that I owe, but it's greater than 0. So because this is an average, because this is an aggregate function, I have to go and I have to use a subquery with it. If I have to use, if any aggregate functions, I'm going to have to use some type of subquery with that. All right, the next one, the all keyword. So total is greater than all, which means that if it was 1 and 2, it would be the same thing as greater than 1. That would return 1 and 2. Total is less than all. If my subset was 1 and 2, it would be the same thing as my total less than 2. If my total is equal to all, that means that, and my subset was 1 and 2, that is the same thing as stating total equals to 1 and total equals to 2. We can see here that that is a much simpler statement. And then we have total not equal to all, same subset. It's the same thing as total not equal to 1 and total not equal to 2. Now it looks like I left off the parentheses there. So let's go through and let's use a query that uses all. So coming down, I have I'm going to select my vendor name, my invoice total. From my invoices with a synonym of I, I'm going to join that to my vendors table with a synonym of V, and then I'm going to join them on my vendor ID, where my invoice total is greater than all. And my subset for all in this case would be my invoice total from invoices where my vendor ID equals 34. So my vendor ID that equals 34, I want to bring back all the totals. So this is a very specific vendor. Let's go ahead and let's run this and see what we come up with. So I have two values. So my vendor ID 34, I had two invoices from. One invoice was $116. The other one was $1,083. So this is my subset. So my subset means that my invoice total is going to be greater than 116 and greater than 1083. So it's really going to be, because it's greater than, it's going to be greater than 116. And I'm going to go and I'm going to sort those by vendor name, and I'll have my invoice total within that. So let's go ahead and run this outer query. So I have my invoice totals. I've sorted them by vendor name, but as we go through here, we can see that all of my totals are larger than the ones that I have for my subtotal. Let me run that one more time. So again, my subtotal was 116 and 1083. If it's greater than those, then it should be returned. So my lowest was 1083, and I don't see anything in my invoice total with that. So my all keyword again means all in this particular subset. And in this particular subset, I return two values. So that was my all keyword used in a join statement. The next one is my any. My any means that if my total is greater than any of these, so my total is greater than 1 or 2 is the same thing as total is greater than 1. Total is less than my subset 1 and 2 means the same thing as total less than 2. And then total is equal to any is the same thing as total equals to 1 or 2, or total is not equal to 1 or 2. So if I come down here, I have a query where my total is less than anything from my invoice, where I'm going to select my invoice total from invoices where my vendor ID equals 115. So if I just run my inner query, I come up with 6, 25.67, 6, and 6. Let me get rid of some of this so we can see this a little bit clearer. And so once I have that, and I'm just going to go ahead, and it looks like I deleted the semicolon. I'm going to put the semicolon down there, and then I'm going to run my outer query. And my outer query has my vendor name, my invoice number, and my invoice total. So this returns anything that was greater than 6. So it is, I'm sorry, yeah, anything that was greater than 6. So I have 6 is my lowest, 10, 10, and so forth. So now let's go, and so any means that I'm going to return that it's, if it's greater than any of those. My all means that I'm going to return everything that's greater than all of these. So the greatest of all of those, I think, was 1063. So that's any, that's all. So our next one, we have a correlated subquery. And what this does is if we go and we look at our inner query is going to return the average of my invoice total, where I'm pulling it from my invoices and I'm matching it up with my invoices from the main. So it's going to pull everything from my invoice sub and where that equals my main. So if I go through and I run just this, it comes up with an error because it's saying, I don't know what INV main is. That pulls it from my invoice main up here. So that's pulling everything. And so if I run the entire query, then it works. So this is one of those ones where the sub won't stand on its own. You could pull the average really quick from there, 1879, we saw that earlier, and now I want to match from my invoice. I want to match from my sub to my main, and it's called sub because it's a subquery, to my main. I want to match those where my vendor IDs match. So if I go through and I run the entire thing, it comes up with my vendor ID, my invoice number, and my invoice total. Coming down a little bit, this will make a little bit more sense as we go through. We have the keyword exists, and the keyword exists is whether it is part of the return set or the result set, or it's not part of the result set. So it's just looking to see if those exist or those are a part of that particular result set. So I'm going to go and I'm going to run just the query, or excuse me, the subquery. It's going to select everything from my invoices. And let me come down. So let me run the subquery. Select all from invoices where my invoice.vendor ID equals my vendors.vendor ID. Because I didn't pull in my table in my from statement, I'm not able to go through and match it with anything. So I have to run the full query. So the full query returns my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor state from my vendors where it exists matching with my invoices. So this is saying where I have a vendor that I have an invoice with, it's going to return that entire list. And I want to return only the vendors that do not exist there. So if I go and I run this full query, it will return my vendor ID, my vendor name, and my vendor state. This query is the exact same query as we did up above. So let me scroll up. It's the same thing as we did with the left join. And it's the same thing that we did with our our subquery in our where statement. In this case, we're using our subquery, coming down a little bit more. We're using our subquery with not exists in our where statement. So 3 ways to go and come up with the exact same results. This select all from invoices, I don't think is the most efficient way because you're returning all of the pieces of data, and the larger result sets, the less efficient your query is going to be. So what we've returned so far, for the most part, from our subqueries is one value or a list of the same value, a single column. The next thing we're going to talk about is an inline view. And an inline view is really a very, very temporary table. But the temporary table contains columns and rows. Every row is a record, every column is a field, just like a table. But it's a temporary thing, and that you go and you use this or you access data in there just like you would a normal table. So we can see this query that uses an inline view. And I'm coming down so we can see the whole query. And so we have a query here, select vendor ID. We're going to select the average invoice as average invoice total. So that returns 2 columns from our invoices that have an average invoice of $4,900 or more. And we're going to group by the vendor. And then we have a synonym for the whole table, or in this case, our inline view. And then we're going to join that on matching vendor IDs from our invoice table. So let's just run this one real quick. So our inner query will return our vendor ID and the average invoice total for that particular vendor where the invoice total is greater than $4,900. So then we're going to use this table and we're going to match our vendor IDs from our invoices. So we have 5 vendors that we're going to match. We're going to group them all by vendor ID, and then we're going to order them by the max invoice date. I'm going to come back up to my select clause. We're going to show the vendor ID, the max vendor the max invoice date as the last invoice date and the average invoice total, and we'll display that as average invoice total. So let's go ahead and run this whole select statement. We have our same five vendors that we saw before. We're showing the last invoice date that they had and the overall average. So this is a great way to go and to identify the last time that you've paid them and their average invoice total for all their invoices. So we have our inner query that returns a table like structure that we're going to call an inline view. So our table-like structure is a temporary view. It's only available during this whole select statement. Once we finish the select statement, that view is going to go away. So what we're really doing is we're taking a subset of information from our invoices. We need more than one column because we want information from both of those columns. We're using an aggregate function for our second column in our inline view, and we're using two aggregate functions in our overall result set. So again, once I run this whole thing, we have our vendor ID, the last time that we've cut them, the last invoice date, and the average invoice total. So this was a subquery in your from clause. We've used subqueries in our where clauses, but this is a subquery in our from clause. Typically, your from clauses will have an inline view. Your next one that we're going to look at has a subquery within our select clause. So our subquery is going and finding the max invoice date for my invoices where my invoice ID, where my vendor ID for my invoices and my vendor table match. And it's going to return that as my latest inventory. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. I have my vendor name, and the last invoice date. And the last invoice date, remember max returns one value. So it's going to return one value in this case for each one of my vendors where my vendor ID matches my invoice table and my vendor table. So let me get both of these on the screen, but my next one is doing the same thing with a join. So I have that with a correlated subquery, and here I'm going to use a left join. So it's pulling everything from my vendor table. It's going to populate what I have from my invoice table where my vendor ID matches. It's going to group by my vendor name, and then it will return my max invoice date. Remember, I can only use max within a group by expression or within a subquery. So if I go and I run this, I have my vendor name and my latest invoice. And I apologize, I said you could only use this with a group by. In this case, you're looking for your max invoice date by vendor, so you need the group by because you're going to go and you're going to grab all the vendors in common, and then from there you're going to go and you're going to look for the latest invoice date from them. You could use an aggregate function without a group by, but it's only going to return one date for you. So again, here I've done the exact same thing using a join as I've done up here with a subquery in my select clause. So the next example uses within your select statement, it has three subqueries. It has a subquery in the from, and it has two subqueries in the join. You can see that my outer subquery, called top and state, also has a inner subquery. So you have your main, one subquery, two subqueries, and this subquery also has a subquery within it. You can see that they all have synonyms at the end, so we're going to refer to those synonyms throughout the query. In this case, it's pulling my vendor state, my vendor name, and some of my invoices from these subqueries. So I'm going to pull it from summary 1. Summary 1 says to select my vendor state and my vendor name. I'm going to total up the invoice total. And I'm going to do this from joining my invoices to my vendors where my vendor IDs match. I want to group them by the state and the vendor name. So if I go through and I just run this, it comes down, I have my vendor state, my vendor name, and my overall sum. And then I'm going to join that again using a subquery. And let's go into my inner subquery. It looks familiar, doesn't it? My vendor state, my vendor name, my sum of invoices. I'm going to join this on my invoice and my vendors where my IDs match, and I'm going to group them by my vendor state, my vendor name. So this is the exact same subquery that I'm using in my from. I need it in my join because I need it to use that to select my max of my invoices. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to run the outer query since we're already familiar with the subquery. And so my outer query in this particular subquery gives me my vendor state and my sum of all my invoices. Now I'm going to match my summary 1 vendor state with my top end state from my vendor. I'm going to match my summary 1 vendor state and my top end state and my vendor state. So I'm going to match my vendor state and my sum of invoices, and I'm going to summarize them by vendor state. So let me come back and run the whole thing. And then we can see, let me bring back the whole query. We can see that, I can't fit it all onto the screen, that I have the top vendor in Arizona as well, Wells Fargo, with a sum of 662. My top one in Nevada is United Postal Service with 23,000. And now I can see by state which vendor has the most invoices. So this is a much more complicated query. It has 3 subqueries in it, 1 in the from, 2 in the join, which are really still part of the from. And it's trying to identify or trying to give me some aggregate information. In this case, I want to know the vendor that has the highest sum of invoices. So the last part I'm going to show you is subfactoring. I like subfactoring much better than I like all of that mess that we went through in the 3 subqueries. This looks very messy. It's very hard to go and to debug, to maintain. The factoring allows you to create queries and then and within those queries name them and then use those names within your overall query. So your subqueries you're going to name and then you're going to reference that name in your query. So I'm taking that previous one that had the 3 subqueries in it and I'm just going to break it down into subfactoring. So my first query is going to select my vendor name and my vendor state. It's going to sum the invoice total, and it's going to join my vendors where my vendor ID equals my, in my invoice table equals my vendor table. So vendors that I have an invoice with. So this query is the same thing as our first subquery in the one above. So we have the select vendor state, vendor name. We're going to get the invoice total. We're going to join them on the vendor ID, and we're going to group them by the vendor state and the vendor name. So we're going to use the summary multiple times. So with summary as, we'll create your subfactoring. So this, again, will return the same thing that we saw above. We have our vendor state, our vendor name, and then the sum of their invoices. And then our inner query that we had above with the max summary of invoices. We used our max summary of invoices, and then we group them on that inline table. So that inline table, excuse me, the inline view is the same thing as our summary. So now we can just refer to it as summary. We don't have to rewrite all of this stuff. We can go and we can refer to it as often as we want to within our overall select statement. You have to start your subfactoring with. You're going to name your query and you're going to use the keyword as. And in this case, you have to use as. And then we're going to have our query within there, and we put parentheses around it. We separate as many subfactoring queries as we want to, and we can separate those with a comma. Our next one we name top of state, and then our query in here refers to summary that we see at the top. So instead of rewriting all of this like we did, and I'm going to move back up, like we did in here and we called it summary 2, we don't have to rewrite it. The great thing about it is that once we know it's working, then we don't have to modify it. We don't have to maneuver it around. And if there are changes that come about, we make the changes in one spot, and that query, so this query up here, any changes we make, when we reference it, it will update, it will reflect those updated changes. So now we have our summary subfactor, our top and state subfactor query, and then we come down to our actual query that uses those. So we can see that we have summary in here. We use this very similar to what we used with our full names for our table. So it's summary dot whatever column name. So I'm going to retrieve this from my summary subfactoring, and I'm going to retrieve the vendor state and the vendor name. And then I'm going to go to my top of state subfactoring query, and I'm going to retrieve the sum of the invoices. So my sum of invoices, it happens to be my alias, so I'm going to return that. I'm going to match it on, and I'm going to use a join. So I'm going to match my summary and top of state, and I'm going to match it where my vendor state from my summary and my top of state subqueries match. I'm also going to match it where my sum of invoices from my summary and my top of state match. And I'm going to order it by my vendor state. So if I go through and I run this, which is, let me turn on my lines, which is, roughly 7 or 8 lines, and I go and I run it, it tells me my table of view doesn't exist. That's because I only ran this. So now if I run and I include my subfactoring, so I have to come all the way up to line 210, and I rerun it, I get my 10 rows. This is the exact same thing, or the exact same results that we got within this really kind of crazy query that uses multiple subqueries. So that's down in here where we use multiple subqueries. We actually had 3 subqueries in there. These are still subqueries, but we're using subfactoring for them. And again, the benefit of the subfactoring is that we only have to write the subfactor once, and then we can refer to it in our query. The life of the subfactoring is only within that select clause, and it returns the same thing. But I think this 7 lines of code, you do have to include your factoring with that, but the 7 lines of code are much easier to maintain than this big nasty subquery within a query within a query above. You're going to become very familiar or very comfortable with one versus the other. Like I said, I like the subfactoring much better because if you have a change to make, it's much easier to make within the subfactoring queries. So the book lays out a really nice procedure for building your complex queries. 1, state the problem to be solved in English and state it in detailed fashion. For those of you that are taking or have taken a programming class, write your algorithm for it. You can use pseudocode or English to outline the query. Then go through and code each subquery. Once you have each subquery working and you've tested them, then start building those together into your overall query. Do not, let me say this again, do not start a complex query from the top to the bottom and expect that it's going to come out fine. You want to write the smallest amount of code, and you want to be able to verify that code before you go on to the next one, or before you go and you add additional queries to your subquery. Start small, work big. So I want you to go in and complete the exercises on pages 211, exercise 1 through 9. This will give you practice writing your subqueries. If you have questions on this, please contact me. Come see me during my office hours, go to the online sessions. Take care and have a great day.